Between 2022 and 2025, a wave of youth-led protests swept the globe, often called Gen Z movements. From South Asia to Southeast Asia, Latin America to parts of Africa and the Middle East, young people took to the streets demanding accountability, dignity, and economic relief. These protests stood out not just for their size, but for their unique style. They rejected traditional political parties, avoided clear leadership, and used internet culture as their common language. Anime flags, memes, leaderless crowds, and viral slogans replaced conventional ideology, party banners, and organized groups. At first glance, it seemed revolutionary. Many governments were shaken, some leaders stepped down, and the media hailed a new generation awakening. But over time, a pattern became clear. Short-term wins didn't lead to lasting change. Systems remained intact. Elites adapted. Economic pressures persisted. Here's why. Another major reason Gen Z protests failed to achieve lasting success lies in modern states. Governments today are not fragile entities that collapse under street pressure alone. They control bureaucracies, courts, security forces, and budgets. They can wait. Protesters, by contrast, have limited endurance. They have jobs, exams, family responsibilities, and financial constraints. Even the most passionate movement eventually faces fatigue. Time favors institutions, not crowds. States understand this and often respond with strategic patience rather than immediate repression. They allow protests to burn themselves out while preparing to reassert control once numbers decline. Economic realities also play a decisive role. Many Gen Z protests were triggered by economic crises: rising prices, unemployment, currency depreciation, and debt. Ironically, these same economic conditions make sustained protests more difficult. As costs rise and incomes stagnate, people cannot afford to stay on the streets indefinitely. Survival takes precedence over activism. Once daily life becomes harder, protest participation declines, not because grievances disappear, but because energy is redirected toward coping. Governments exploit this dynamic by waiting until economic pressure fractures the movement from within. Investor behavior adds complexity to the situation. When large protests break out, especially those threatening political stability, investors tend to react swiftly. They don't wait to judge the morality of a movement. Instead, they evaluate the risk. Political uncertainty, leadership gaps, and unpredictable policies make investing less appealing. Consequently, capital starts to flow out. Foreign investors sell bonds, pause projects, and withdraw funds, while local elites move money abroad. Currency reserves decline, inflation climbs, and economic conditions worsen. This fuels public anxiety and reduces patience for ongoing unrest. Protesters might feel empowered, but markets sense danger and react faster than politicians. Once capital leaves, governments often face financial crises. Tax revenues fall, debt payments become urgent, and reserves shrink. Many turn to international financial institutions, especially the IMF. The IMF aims to stabilize the economy, but protesters often misunderstand its role. Its programs mainly seek to restore investor confidence and ensure debt repayment, not to address the social issues behind protests. Conditions attached, such as spending cuts, tax hikes, subsidy cuts, and currency devaluation, hurt ordinary people in the short term. This creates a paradox. A protest movement may succeed in overthrowing a government, only for the new one to impose harsher economic measures under IMF pressure. Public anger shifts from political leaders to daily survival, sapping support for the movement. This cycle repeats in different regions. Short-term protests lead to instability, which causes investors to withdraw. That triggers economic crises and IMF intervention, resulting in austerity measures, protest fatigue, and eventual stabilization, often under familiar elites. The faces change, but the system remains the same. Another challenge for Gen Z protests is their relationship with older generations. While youth energy can be powerful, lasting change usually needs broad coalitions. Workers, professionals, rural communities, and older voters hold key powers, especially in elections. Many Gen Z movements struggle to build these alliances. Their language, symbols, and tactics resonated with peers but less with others. Older citizens sometimes saw protests as chaotic, unrealistic, or disconnected from governance. Without support across generations, these movements remain impressive in size but limited politically. Digital culture played a mixed role. Social media allowed quick mobilization, global visibility, and creative expression. Memes, viral videos, and pop culture made protests relatable and emotionally engaging. But it also led to fragmentation. Online disagreements escalated fast, narratives shifted daily, and attention spans shortened. The same algorithms that amplified protest content also fueled internal conflicts. Movements relying heavily on online energy struggled to stay coherent after the initial viral burst. The use of pop culture symbols like anime flags highlighted a deeper shift in how Generation Z engages with politics. These symbols let protesters voice dissent without subscribing to traditional ideologies, offering emotional unity without strict commitment. While this inclusivity encouraged more participation, it also muddled political clarity. Governments could dismiss these protests as childish or frivolous, and supporters often struggled to outline concrete goals beyond symbolic resistance. In politics, symbols can rally people, but they can't govern. Another major issue was the lack of real influence within institutions. Successful movements don't just stop on the streets. They move into political parties, unions, local councils, legislatures, and courts. Many Gen Z protesters rejected these avenues, seeing them as corrupt or pointless. That skepticism was understandable, but left these movements without a way to turn pressure into policy. Without footholds in institutions, gains were fleeting and easy to lose. The system stayed intact, just waiting for public attention to shift elsewhere. The global landscape of the 2020s also made protests harder to succeed. Unlike previous eras, today's governments have advanced surveillance, legal tools, and crowd control methods. Repression is often subtle: legal charges, online monitoring, bureaucratic delays, rather than overt violence. This reduces international outrage but gradually weakens movements. Protesters tire not from violent crackdowns but from constant friction. Economic challenges also limited reform opportunities. High debt, fragile supply chains, and geopolitical tensions constrained governments' options. Even sympathetic leaders found it tough to promise new jobs, subsidies, or welfare, especially when budgets were strained and creditors demanded discipline. This gap between hopes and reality disillusioned supporters and eroded trust in change. It's also vital to recognize the psychological side of protests. Demonstrations foster a sense of collective power. Standing together, chanting, occupying space, all feed the feeling that change is within reach. When that feeling fades, disappointment sets in. Movements rooted purely in emotion are vulnerable to burnout. Once the adrenaline wears off, participants may disengage, leaving little behind. That doesn't mean Gen Z protests were meaningless. They reshaped political conversations, exposed cracks in elite legitimacy, and showed the strength of youth mobilization. They pressured governments to confront issues they preferred to ignore, and even toppled some untouchable leaders. These are real achievements, but they don't amount to systemic change. Lasting change requires a slow, boring process: building organization, making compromises, gaining policy expertise, and being persistent. It involves entering flawed institutions and gradually reshaping them. It demands accepting small wins over dramatic moments. Many Gen Z movements rejected this path, frustrated with systems they saw as rigged. But completely rejecting institutions leaves power in the hands of those already within them. The key lesson from the 2022 to 2025 protests isn't that Gen Z is apathetic or incapable. It's that protests alone aren't enough. Street demonstrations can disrupt, but they can't replace governance. They can create openings but can't fill them. Without leadership, strategic alliances, and institutional presence, even the biggest movements fade. In the end, these protests didn't fail because the demands were wrong, but because the approach was incomplete. They were good at saying no to the current order, but struggled to say yes to a clear alternative. They challenged power but didn't fully seize it. They changed the conversation but not the structures. If future movements learn from these lessons by combining cultural energy with organization, emotional unity with political clarity, protest with participation, they might find new paths to success. Until then, history is likely to repeat itself. Short-term headlines, long-term systems unchanged, and a generation wondering why real change always seems so close but slips away.